Buenos días, buenas tardes.
We're right on time. Good morning, good afternoon. I wish to give you a warm welcome to this session. My name is Aida Figaria. I'm in charge of the coordination of the Let's Slack platform. And today I will be entailing the moderation and this session for each one of you. Before we begin, I want to mention that our thoughts are with all of our colleagues of Central America and Colombia that are suffering the hurricanes taking place. So hopefully there's a recovery to be foreseen. Well, we're going to begin with connecting CDR approaches, SDGs, and zero net emissions strategies in Latin America and the Caribbean. This webinar is the fourth webinar of a series of webinars that we have been organizing together with the Let's Slack platform, with the Climate Governance Initiative, C2G, and ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Before we begin, and because this webinar has interpretation, I'm going to provide you with a few general guidelines. The first one is to say just a few words in English to provide the instructions for those of you who are not understanding the language.
This by finding the button of interpretation and choosing English from the language options. The webinar is going to be all in Spanish, so you can stay in that English channel for the rest of the webinar. Listo, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Other general indications for the session throughout the chat, we'll be sharing links or general indications. We also received your input and general questions in operational issues regarding the webinar. The specific questions you may have for the panelists, we'll also be using Zoom for that, but we'll be using the option of Q&A. So the specific questions that you have for panelists, please do so through the Q&A option that we have marked right here. And also, if you see questions that have been made previously by other participants and you are fond of them, there's an option to say that you like that question. And in that way, we filter them and prioritize them based on the questions that have the most votes, so to speak. We're also going to have participation together with each one of you. The participants will be using, as in other occasions that you've been using previously, is Slido. You have to log into slido.com and to use the code C2G. We'll be providing the specific instructions when we reach those slides, and the whole session is being recorded. This session, all the material related to them, as well as the documents that we are sharing with our panelists, will be available in the webpage of this webinar in the link that you see below. Before we go specifically to the issues concerning this webinar, this fourth webinar is in the framework of a joint regional webinar that is called Empowering Recovery of Sustainable Post-COVID-19 Latin America and the Caribbean. This is between the IDB, the UNDP, and the Let's Slack platform as a joint effort, also with organizations that implement them: GIZ, ECLAC, Avina, Sustentar, and Libélula. This program of the joint regional event began with a milestone that was launched at the beginning of September with a set of events that we have done so between September and November, and there's a final milestone scheduled for next week. We are beginning at, it's between the hubs of events. It's also allocated between three main axes: the long-term strategies in zero net emissions, and also increasing the ambition of commitments that is in charge of UNDP, GIZ, and ECLAC. And the last one, in transportation, decarbonizing transportation for a sustainable and resilient recovery, is also under the work group of Sustentar and the partnership of LEDs. And this specific session is increasing the ambition of the NDCs. Prior to going to our panel of experts, we wish to have a small interaction with you. To start using Slido, I'll be requesting from each one of you to connect from your phone or your PC to slido.com. Let's use the code #C2G and tell us from which country you are connecting. You have to simply fill in the country, the name of the country, without any further ado, without any more text, so we can group up the countries and to see where we have the most participants from. And please do not close Slido because we have another question and one last webinar question, and I'll be requesting for you to please leave it open. It won't take more than a few seconds, so Alejandra, if you already shared it, if you can go or provide the link through the chat in case you haven't found it. I see you already added it. The link that we shared through the chat box. So you can answer what country you are joining us from. From Peru, we have the largest amount of participants. Those who have logged in from the streaming of Facebook, we provide you with a warm welcome, and please log into Slido and to comment on what country you are connecting from.
Un par de segundos más. Tenemos 60 y más de 70 personas conectadas.
More than 70 people have logged in. More than 40 answers so far.
Ok. Muy bien. Entonces tenemos una buena representación.
So we have a good level of representation from different countries within the region. The following question is quite related to this issue, and what we wish to know is how familiarized you are with the concept of carbon dioxide removal. Before we begin looking into the agenda, have you ever heard of it? Maybe you don't know what it's about, you've heard of it, but you don't understand what it's about, you have many doubts. Not familiarized at all, you don't understand it thoroughly, you've heard of it. Do you think you manage it? Do you feel comfortable discussing these sorts of topics, or you're highly familiarized and you even work on this specific issue? These are the 4 options. I know it and understand it well. And how do you feel in this regard? Nearly half of the audience understand the issue thoroughly, which is very positive for us. The good thing is that no one has answered that they've never heard of it. I thought that percentage was going to be a bit higher. But nearly 50% is answering that this is an issue that they've heard of and understand very well. So this allows us for the other 50% for us to hold this discussion with the participants and the panelists. This helps for those who don't understand it that well to feel that after this webinar, the issue is a bit more clear. And if you have any doubts, questions, we are very open to hear from you. And the panelists we have today will help us out in answering. So before we go through the agenda, we're going to speak of how we'll move forward. We have 3 presentations with which we'll hold this discussion. The 3 of them will be all together. The first presentation is regarding carbon dioxide removal and governance issues. This will be led by Vanessa Suarez. She's an policy advisor of Carbon 180. She works with the federal policies in the United States, in natural and technological solutions in CDR. She attended Berkeley, where she studied natural resources, and she also participated in a thesis of carbon dioxide removal from soil. The second presentation will speak of the focus of CDR at a large scale, the possible benefits and risks to be able to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. This presentation will be entailed by Natalia Roviano. She has worked in issues related to development and sustainability throughout her career, mainly with the United Nations Programme for Development, the UNDP, and she has been part of the SDG goals, and she's also undergoing a PhD in the London University in Scotland. And she also focuses on negative emissions and zero net emission. We also have a presentation of the net zero emission strategies in Latin America and the role of this focus of CDR approaches at a broader scale. Carbon dioxide removal in this transition. And Jose Luis Samaniego will lead this presentation. He is head of the Commission of CDR and Human Settlements. He is the economist of the Mexican University and also a PhD on economics by the Autonomous University of Mexico. He has written a number of articles, public policies challenges. He has been a consultant in the World Bank, UNDP, NUMA, and TVF, among other international organizations. Each one of these presentations will take around 10 to 15 minutes. And once we have finished with these 3 presentations, we'll begin with this block of questions and answers. As you have any sorts of doubts to the panelists, please provide them through the Q&A box. If there are questions that have already been made, you can give them a like. You can like them. We'll give a few minutes to the panelists so that we can solve them jointly. And prior to that, we'll be closing with the one last intervention, and hopefully with your participation. Without any further ado, I give the floor to Vanessa so that she can let us know what she'll be presenting today. The floor is yours, Vanessa. Many thanks, Aida. Let me share my screen. Good morning to all of those joining us today. Hopefully you are fine right now. It's a pleasure to participate in this webinar coordinated by SLAC and the Carnegie Government Initiative. Vanessa Suarez is my name, and I'm an advisor of Carbon 180. In this occasion, I expect to tell you more about the different focus of carbon dioxide removal and the different governance provisions. First of all, what is carbon dioxide removal and why is it important? Abbreviated as CDR is a process to extract carbon dioxide through the atmosphere throughout technologies and engineering or land processes, and to store them for a long amount of time using geological underground system, soils, plants, and many times commercial products. Recent reports on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations has shown that implementing carbon dioxide removal will be necessary aside from drastic emissions to be dropped and to avoid global warming between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. Therefore, to escalate the elimination of carbon in a sustainable way in Latin America and the Caribbean and at a worldwide level will require mechanisms in governance.
There are several solutions to remove carbon from soil, technological, and hybrid that are in different stages of preparation and with different costs, effects, and considerations for sustainability and governance. Let's start with technological solutions. These solutions for the removal of carbon are important to meet climate objectives because several reports have shown that soil emissions by themselves will not be enough to limit the increase of the global temperature. And they also promote economic if they are incremented sustainably. There are several technological approaches for CDR. Air capture involves the capture of air directly from the environment through chemical and physical processes. Ocean direct capture provides this capture from the ocean through an engineering process. And this captured carbon can be stored under the earth for centuries and can be used then for fuel in the aviation industry or as chemicals. This process is called carbon usage. And finally, we have carbon mineralization that is focused on removing carbon from air and storing it as minerals. We also have soil solutions. Biological systems offer a variety of opportunities to remove carbon, with the potential of being broadly adopted in several regions and landscapes. Apart from improving the storage of carbon, they can provide a variety of benefits, both in the environmental and the economic sectors, if they are implemented sustainably. Forests can be great stumps, and they have great opportunity for the removal of carbon. In forest, carbon is captured by plants and it is stored as biomass. In agricultural systems, it nurtures crops. This natural process can be reinforced through several management practices and coverage crops. In addition, coastal ecosystems remove atmospheric carbon through the growth of plants and organic carbon accumulated in the seabed. Some solutions include both technological and soil components, and they're known as hybrid solutions. In this chart, you can see the main hybrid approach of the CDR that is known as BECCS. BECCS is the process of capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere using vegetable biomass, then converting it into energy and then capturing this carbon to store it in the long term. Here we can see some of the levels of preparation, technological preparation for different solutions of carbon removal. These are only estimations. I would like to say that although one focus or one approach can be quite developed, it does not mean that this is the most significant solution to remove carbon. We need several solutions in different levels to stop climate change. The broad range of solutions of carbon removal are gaining the benefits here. And although these solutions grow, the need to scale up these solutions is essential. That's why several interested parties must participate in the governance of CDR. And through effective governance, communities and countries can determine which are the best solutions for them, but also how to implement them. In the international atmosphere, the governance for CDR is basically within the regime of climate change of the United Nations. There are three frameworks that are relevant for UNFCCC, we have the Framework Convention of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. To start, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has the objective of stabilizing concentrations of greenhouse emissions in the atmosphere and to avoid anthropogenic interference with the climate system. It aims to reduce them in the second part of the century, and it also contains provisions on reporting the removal of carbon, reduce the emissions derived from deforestation and forestry degradation. Kyoto Protocol operationalized the UNFCCC by limiting the emissions of greenhouse gas effects. The protocol also contains provisions on the mechanism of CDR and also the provisions of carbon dioxide and flexible provisions on forestation and reforestation. And finally, the Paris Agreement is based on UNFCCC and unites all nations under a common cause to combat climate change with a greater support for developing countries. The agreement contains a transparency framework where each country can understand and agree determine contributions at an internal level and a global inventory to quantify the existence of carbon dioxide at a global level. It also sets rules for market mechanisms and international financial objectives. Apart from these frameworks and agreements, the IPCC, the Organization for Science Evaluation related with climate change, includes relevant guidelines for this framework. It includes reports to understand best the subject of carbon removal and the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Despite the existing provisions, there are still many gaps and significant challenges for the focus on the CDR. It is also important to mention that different solutions need different needs for governance to do this in a sustainable manner. It is probable that CDR at large scale will be necessary to limit global warming at the necessary levels to address climate risks. However, its implementation will need governance at different levels to guarantee a sustainable deployment and at equal levels. It will also be important to consider the cost and benefits for all the projects in the different countries to be able to manage these projects in a sustainable manner. And also complement them with the SDGs can allow us to understand in a better way where we have the best opportunities and also implement the solutions in a better way. With this, I have concluded my presentation. Thank you very much for your time and attention. My colleague Natalia will now talk about the overview of large-scale carbon dioxide removal approaches and governance provisions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vanessa, for your presentation. I think that it has been an introductory framework that sets the context for this topic and that we will now address with Natalia and Jose Luis. Before giving the floor to Natalia, I would like to welcome all those participants that have been logging in the last minutes. Also, I would like to remind you that we will be answering your questions in the Q&A panel. And if there are any questions that have already been asked, please like them so we can give them an order of importance. And without further ado, Natalia, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Let me share my presentation.
Okay, buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias.
Good morning to all of you. Thank you very much to Let's LAC for inviting me today. As it was mentioned before, I'm a PhD candidate in the Luxus University in the Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies, and I am in charge of looking at governance issues from a justice perspective.
¿Por qué hablar de a gran escala?
Why should we talk about CDR at a large scale? In the report of IPCC in 2018, it says that emissions should reach their maximum point in 2020 and start being reduced from 7 to 8% annually until getting to zero net by 2050 to get to a 50% of possibilities to reach the objective of 1.5 degrees Celsius, or to get to a 4% annually, getting to zero net by 2075 to reach the goal of 2 degrees Celsius. This tells us that we do not have much time. And most of the scenarios of the assessed by the IPCC, they assume the use of techniques of CDR to achieve global climate objectives. These are known in English as integrated assessment models, and where they have several factors, economic, political, social factors, to look at possible future climate scenarios. In these models, the use of soil is used, reforestation, afforestation, and that combines two technologies that already exist. I won't give you more details about this because Vanessa already talked about this in her presentation. IPCC, however, recognizes constraints in terms of viability and sustainability for these technologies. For instance, if the world decided to use bioenergy with capture and storage of carbon to get to these goals, we would need a territory equivalent to 1 or 2 times the size of what we currently have. And that could lead to conflict in terms of the use of land, the access of resource, water, biodiversity, the rights of the people, local communities, the food safety, for instance. And that is why it is important to consider a portfolio of diverse techniques of CDR. We cannot think only about 1 or 2 to attain these goals. There is a large portfolio available and it's growing day after day, but none of these technologies is currently available to be implemented. And that is why we need to have a diverse portfolio, ideally with a mix of technologies that can adapt to the context of each country. This chart is from a publication from C2G in 2018, where we can see the SDGs alignment with the different technologies. In gray, you can see the potential research rights
o brechas claves al respecto.
or key gaps. Here, as you can see, we have a lot of gray in this chart, so we have a lot to do. In red, we see the risks that may be involved between the SDGs and technologies. In yellow, these are interesting because these are technologies that can be both with positive or negative interactions, and therefore we need to consider the how. We need to see how we can implement these technologies. Over the last years, several solutions based on nature have been provided, both at a local and global level, as one of the best alternatives to achieve them. And in Latin America, this is broadly used. However, we need to take into consideration some issues for these solutions to be sustainable and for them not to have a negative connotation with communities. For instance, if you have trees, this can absorb more carbon than forests, but it can lead to issues with the use of water, the use of land, or others. Therefore, this is very important to consider. We need to consider benefits and any problems that may arise. The use of land is one of these considerations that we must take into account, and also carbon sequestration. And as we know, this is not something new. It has been discussed for a long time now. And in the Kyoto Protocol, we had many lessons in this regards. And REDS Plus, we also obtained many lessons that can be applied when designing socio-technical systems for carbon removal. This is to avoid any negative incentives. We know that mitigation is still very important. The more mitigation we have, the less carbon removal we will need, and therefore we need to avoid that once these systems are created, because markets will have an important role in the future, to avoid them, to avoid the offsets, to be cheap enough so that mitigation is not as attractive for some countries.
One important option is to have mitigation goals in order to have carbon dioxide removal. They should be separate, and the different technologies, specifically the ones that require infrastructure, in terms of storing carbon, for instance, will require infrastructure that will be available in the long run. So it's important to consider the planning, the critical infrastructure, and the co-benefits that these sorts of infrastructures would have in the social scenario. This chart is interesting because one of the most important issues for CDR in Latin America and the Caribbean, not only thinking in the long term of how we are going to approach it and the benefits or co-benefits could exist in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, will be seen in the upcoming years in future global negotiations, climate negotiations. This chart presents us, for instance, the distribution of the different CDR quotas, where it would be less costful to have carbon dioxide removal. We can observe in yellow Latin America. So in this case, for Latin America, they would have the largest liability or responsibility of carbon dioxide removal because the cost is quite high. The second chart presents historic emissions equity, and orange is United States, and it has a very high level of liability. Latin America is further down, it seems. And the third one shows us accountability in terms of GDP growth. And light green is China. China would have the largest accountability, followed by Europe, and other regions of continents that also have a large amount of accountability. So in the upcoming years, the issue is that these sorts of negotiations will be discussed in this regard, and it's also relevant for the Latin American policy to be involved in this process and to consider all of these variables to be able to make decisions in this regard. With that, I finished my presentation. Many thanks, and I'll give the floor to José Luis.
Sí,
It
parece.
seems Aida has her microphone muted. Luis, I have your presentation, Jose Luis, so I'm going to begin with my presentation to link this to what was introduced by Natalia. What I'll be introducing is a joint field of work with C2D to see if there's a fourth scenario based on the one presented by Natalia, which is the one in which capturing or the large-scale removal actions of carbon dioxide provided with the largest co-benefits. It's not based on accountability or the production cost, but where do we have the largest contribution for development? I'm going to share my screen. We can observe your presentation perfectly well in full screen. We'll see. Vanessa was discussing 3 essential cases, which was afforestation and forest ecosystem restoration, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, enhancing soil carbon content with biochar, enhanced weathering or ocean alkalinization. And we have identified other alternatives with C2G to identify the carbon content in soil or the fertilization of oceans, where Natalia discussed in her diagram. We'll be able to let you know what we found out up to date. In the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, we are setting 2 countries, Argentina and Colombia, as specific cases. As you may observe in the left-hand column, we are analyzing the 6 typologies and the degree in which this has been absorbed in the public policy or by the scientific community or, well, by on-site groups. This is very common for Latin America: reforestation, afforestation, management of ecosystems, management of landscapes. That is within public policies. In the case of Argentina, it also figures in its national contribution and in its national plan of forests and climate change, its plan to reforest native forests. The academic sector has held research in this field, and there are initiatives and projects that are being developed by this specific focus. The same thing occurs with bioenergy, where there's a use of biomass for electric generation. It's used for biofuel. They contribute to renewables, and we have the plan to renew and the use of bioenergy where we utilize them together with the other renewables as solar and wind energy. And it's a project that the government has denominated biomass. There's research taking place and large-scale projects, but whenever we go from point 2 to the other scenarios, we'll see similar cases. Colombia is a bit better, but in the case of Argentina, there is no governmental program that considers recarbonization, soil recarbonization with carbonized biomass. There's research, but no specific or concrete goals, or the weathering of rocks or the alkalinization of oceans, where we have mentioned this in the marine protected areas in Argentina. There's research taking place, but there are still no initiatives. We have promoted a few actions, but there are no plans in operation. There's no direct carbon dioxide capturing, but there are a few initiatives considered, but there's nothing in ocean fertilization. From 3 to 6, these are initiatives that are a long way ahead in order to form part of public policies. In the case of Colombia, we have a somewhat better scenario. The first 2 cases are included in the nationally determined contribution or the National Ecological Restoration Plan or in the development plan, and there are even large-scale programs that are under application. Nothing in terms of actions. There is a research at a laboratory level to restore the carbonization of soils, and there's nothing in mineralization of oceans, capturing carbon directly from the air, except a one in the basins. And there's nothing in regards to oceans. This is part of research in place together with the Foundation Torcuato Tequila. Maybe some of you have heard of this foundation. And what we are requesting from Hernan is to have a contrast with the initial scenario of the potential that we could see with larger potential in each one of these 6 action plans, but that they should identify the potential development of large-scale measurements in terms of the cost for economy, in terms of the contribution for GDP and the added value for economy, on the social scenario, how it contributes to generating employment, and in the 2030 agenda, the potential they have in terms of reducing carbon. This focus is in parallel with ACLAC to look at the potential of the different sectors to contribute towards development. What we are doing in terms of applying to carbon dioxide removal at a larger scale has been done in different sectors for renewables, for electric public transportation, recycling, in order to determine the contribution of the product and the cost for economy, employment, and emissions. And what's the purpose of this? To be able to document the potential of contribution towards development, which is lower in carbon in sectors that are well aligned with the CDCs. Maybe not in an equal measure for the planet and prosperity, but that allow us to ensure that the economy does not make a mistake in the case of betting towards these sectors, as they have a selective GDP growth, and the sectors high in carbon, low in employment, or high costs in economy or impacts on GDP is to be left aside. This is also included in the sector fossil fuels, in the actions, the long-term actions that we consider in terms of the recovery that is well aligned with the NDCs and greener economies. They highlight, aside from sectors, as it is the investment in coverage and quality of waters. It highlights the possibility of fostering and incrementing the payment per environmental services based on nature solutions towards the settlements, rural settlements, throughout green purchases, or throughout jurisdictional arrangements that allows us to pay for environmental services and to provide a larger economic viability for the solutions based on nature, and to allow, therefore, to have interesting scales of the framework of these 6 types, these 6 solutions that we have been observing in the previous presentations. This focus of betting towards greener sectors that can also be produced in Latin America and that also reduce the imports is what we are calling from ECLAC a great impulse for sustainability. There are a few sectors that can say they are good for the environment, good for the economy, and good at a social level simultaneously. Latin America has an issue. That's why we speak about imports, where the growth rate is limited by the relation of imports and exports. The less we export, the more we import, the lower is the growth cap that we have on economy. This is real information. The countries that are worse doing is in 1.4% growth, compatible with what we call the external restriction, meaning they don't have indebtedness, they are not devaluated, they don't have to put a throttle on the economy abruptly, and others are around 2.6 with an external balance. Korea and China are around 5% as a potential growth rate without bumping into the external scenario. We also have a social demand that would allow us to grow at 4% per annum with redistribution, half a point of the GDP annually.
This is quite modest in terms of economic growth, and it may collide with external restrictions, and it's quite high to meet environmental goals. So to compatibilize and have a less demanding rate in social terms, we would have to find employment growth, but also with low imports and with low environmental footprint. And in those sectors, we need to look at the sectors where the alternatives for carbon removal and reduction at large scale seem to comply with this. There are some other sectors that seem to respond to this in renewable energies, electric mobility, digital revolution, the health manufacturing industry, bioeconomics, where we also have environmental services and natural ecosystems, circular economy, and tourism. Here we're talking about increasing the participation in GDP of sector number 5, including large-scale carbon removal alternatives. And here I would like to show you a great example for Chile, where nature-based solutions play an important role, although there aren't any legal solutions that can enable the payment for environmental services, both internally or externally. And here you can see the role that it can have. In the case of Chile, it is very important. There are two elements to highlight. One is to forest a large amount of hectares in the country, where at least 70,000 would be based on native species, and that would manage to capture around 30% of gross emissions in the country. It is estimated that this figure is between 105 and 120 megatons per year. Therefore, an annual capture of 3.43%, and over time, it would go up to 30 megatons. That would be a considerable amount in the annual flow. The other part has to do with stopping degradation process and stopping deforestation in 25% by 2030. What is the idea in this plan of Chile with the restoration of landscapes is to combine it with industrial activities, for instance, energy efficiency, hydrogen, the change of the stock of vehicles to capture 50% of its gross emissions so that you can have a carbon neutrality. This is 50% of the objective of the national contribution of Chile will be with the lowerage of industrial emissions, and 50% will be achieved with nature-based solutions, which implies captures at a large scale or removals at a large scale, such as the ones that we have been mentioning right now. Regarding other countries and status of these 6 alternatives that we have been analyzing, reforestation is included in biodiversity programs in several countries. Bioenergy has also been included in number 2. We can mention Uruguay that has a considerable use of bioenergy. The improvement of the content of carbon in soil with biocarbon. We have Argentina, Brazil is considering it. There are some others at an experimental research level. The weathering of mineralization of rocks or alkalization of the ocean, Brazil is considering this because they want to use the dust generated by these rocks as a fertilizer and the improvement of weathering, enhancement of weathering for carbon sequestration. Nothing in Latin America has direct carbon capturing. And here we have fertilization of the ocean. We have 3 cases, Ecuador, Chile, and Peru, that are considering initiatives, for instance, to produce plankton or the floration of areas near to the seabed to enrich the levels of nutrients for other species or for the release of particles into the ocean, as Natalia was mentioning, for the production of biomass, to have organic material in the bottom of the ocean. The results that we expect to have are not only environmental potential for these alternatives, but also the traction for the agenda of 2030, persons and the planet. And with this, I would like to conclude my presentation.
Muchas gracias, José Luis.
Thank you very much, José Luis. Your approach was quite interesting. I'm sorry, I lost my connection, so I wasn't able to present you. But I believe that the 3 presentations were quite interesting. The dioxide removal and getting to know the different alternative solutions and technologies available was quite interesting. With Natalia, we have been linking it with the SDGs. We saw risks and opportunities and improvements. And Jose Luis, you have allowed us to put this into practice and to see it close to us. And that is the objective of this session, for us to see it where we live, not something that is far from us. And I believe that it is important for us to start engaging in these conversations so that the general population and the different parties can be part of these conversations. One of the reflections that I want to make right now, Jose Luis, is that when you're not familiarized with the topic and you hear about carbon dioxide management technologies, you imagine this the direct capture line of carbon dioxide in the air, but now I see several other technologies that you were mentioning, and you were also mentioning that countries are also approaching them. Thank you very much to the 3 of you for your presentations, because you have allowed us to see what are the different approaches and considerations that we need to have, not only in terms of productions or the concentrations of CO2, but the impact that it will have in order to meet the SDGs. But you have also mentioned the GDP and employment. We have several questions from the attendees. There is one, and I would like to ask Natalia or Vanessa to give us some more details.
Sobre cuál es la diferencia entre eliminación de
And it is the following. What is the difference between carbon dioxide removal and carbon dioxide capturing?
Alguna de las dos hace
So please,
precisión rápida para que si existe una diferencia importante,
could you please tell us what is the difference?
Tener en cuenta. Y después viene una segunda que también les voy a lanzar.
And then we have a second question.
Por favor, de una primera.
We'll read around 2 or 3. I see that probably Jose Luis lost his connection.
Enfoques de eliminación de dióxido de carbono más importantes.
And we also have the question, what are the most important approaches in terms of carbon dioxide removal for Latin America? Maybe we could go into detail, not only where this is being approached, but maybe where we have the greatest level of opportunity in the region. And
mencionar
a second question that I wanted to mention
era que era con respecto a la gobernanza, ¿no? Y qué entendemos como por
do with
gobernanza.
governance
Como,
and what
como
we understand as governance.
Ronda como respuestas bien cortitas
So
de los
I would
de los
like to
tres antes de
ask
preguntas
these
un poco
first
específicas.
3 questions before going into more specific questions that have been asked. Vanessa, please.
Sí, muchas gracias por la pregunta.
Thank you very much for your question.
Entre la RC
The main difference between
el cambio climático.
CDRs and the capture is how they mitigate climate change. CDR is focused on removing carbon that already exists, that is inherited emissions, and capture and storage of carbon has to do with technologies that can reduce the emissions from fuel sources or other emissions. And in that way, they're not mitigating already existing emissions, but they are reducing those emissions that can go into the atmosphere. And that way, they both mitigate, but with different methods.
Gracias, Vanessa. Natalia.
Thank you, Vanessa. Natalia?
Sí, no tengo nada más que agregar.
Well, I have nothing else to add.
Y bueno, yo puedo
I believe that was a good answer.
El tema de gobernanza.
And maybe I would like to address the issue on governance. Many times we think of governance and legislation, but it's not necessarily the case. The definition of governance that we try to use has to do with decision-making and participation from the initial process. And this includes research processes, how research is regulated, where we are headed to, where we're not headed to, and a participative role from the beginning to the end. And includes everything from the beginning to the end, from the idea until the execution.
Gracias, Natalia.
Thank you, Natalia. Jose Luis, would you like to add something regarding the most important approaches in terms of carbon removal for Latin America? Yes, that's a nice question because it has several dimensions. What we're doing with this is to have more a judgment element, because usually the approach is environmental. It has to do with removal of carbon. And you may find externalities, you may find sectors that have collateral benefits that are important for you. Within that, there are 3 topics that I find interesting. And in my opinion, for instance, the mangroves. There are ecosystems that have a very high potentiality for carbon capturing. Let's say a good forest of Oyamel that captures 200 tons per hectare. But if you go to a hectare of mangroves, it captures 800. And 2, if you put people to work on capturing and restoring these forests, you are working with communities that live in the coastline and that could diversify their opportunities. They are usually fishers or farmers. And on the environmental side, you get very good results. On the social side, you get also very good results. And for the tourism sector, which is very important for many countries, you get coastal protection for the tourism sector. And in Latin America, but for those that are located in the southern cone and those that do not have any oceans, they have the need to restore these mangroves. And it is a very good opportunity for them. If we talk about mineralization and fertilization of farmlands through grinding of a rock and weathering, you generate a substitute for agrochemicals. Therefore, if you want to go into niche markets for exports and you want to remove agrochemicals from agriculture, mineralization seems to be an alternative where you're not moving carbon from one place to another. What can happen with biochar, where you are moving the mass from one place to another? You're just putting biomass carbon and putting it into the soil. But with mineralization, you're not doing that. You're creating an additional source, and it has several co-benefits. You can go into organic markets where you have managed to eliminate pesticides and you remove carbon from chemicals. And this is very attractive. The issue of fertilizing oceans by increasing the biological productivity of oceans. And it seems like it has several co-benefits to me. The more dimensions you add to the solution, I believe that you give more alternatives. And these three seem to be very innovative and that can add several benefits to Latin America.
Han sido tres ejemplos bastante buenos y cercanos,
These
¿no?
have been three good examples that are quite close to us that we could approach in the region with these multiple benefits that I think we need to identify in order to promote them. I'm going to read through two questions that I see them highly related to governance. I'm going to leave the microphone open to see who wishes to answer them. Both from Mariela Lascano. The first one, if you consider important to homologate the specific legislation in the environment with the countries that wish to collaborate jointly, or do you consider the agreements, the international agreements we have mentioned in one of the presentations are enough to start working jointly? I understand that this is a perspective, and how do we homologate this in Latin America to be able to foster carbon dioxide removal, or if it's enough with the agreements in place? And the other question is a bit more landed towards the forest issues. And us, without a doubt, governance is a limiting issue in CDRs. And in what ways can we manage and build better measures in Latin America? I don't know who of the three of you have an answer for Mariela. Let me go through with the regional action. I consider that would be quite relevant. There are two sides. Let's assume that we go through the example of organic production because you have already mineralized soils. It would be way more beneficial if you were to have a common recognition standard, because that would avoid to have different accountability. It would be harmonized double-fold in organic production because you have depleted agrochemicals and the agrochemicals that have been replaced. So you could label an international trade that would recognize the attributes of that production, acknowledge them. And as we have seen in Latin American cases, we have seen many spaces that are empty or in an experimental phase. It's way better for the region to approach them jointly so that you can share the results. And in that way, there's a sort of a Latin American school that flattens the learning curve and shares costs and allows you to approach more fields. So if you were to have a functional space in Latin America where you are to work not only in harmonizing the labeling and regulations, but at the same time to share the scientific efforts, this could move in a faster way. It would be way more fruitful for all of us. Thank you, Jose Luis. Natalia, I'm not sure if you want to elaborate on that. Yes, in regards to the international agreements, it's a complicated issue because we have the Paris Agreement that speaks of our aim, and it's the most updated one. And at the same time, we have the IPCC with the scientific approaches and the potential scenarios that we can take to reach these sorts of activities. The issue is that these are recommendations, but these are not mandatory spaces. For instance, this sort of scenario, from here, the next step is to include in the NDCs or to think and to be net negative in countries. There are many countries that expect to be carbon neutral by 2050. I think that's the following step for the planners in Latin America and the Caribbean. I just wish to add somewhat to that. I think that when we are deciding how to implement or develop the solutions of the NDCs, it's very important to think on the context. Many of these solutions might be implemented in nearby local communities. So we'll need legislation, not only at a federal or international level between countries, but also thinking in legislation that will be required in many different levels of the government. Therefore, governance has those different levels in order to consider and bear them in mind. And I'll leave it up to there. Thank you. I have a doubt, and I'm going to ask as a quick answer to that, of who are the most important players that we need to add in these processes. I think governance also includes incorporating and coordinating. Who would you say are the key players that need to work specifically on these issues or make progress on them? I believe that if we wish to aspire to different co-benefits, hopefully it's from all fields, from the national agricultural ministries, livestock. It's a great source of emissions, industrial issues. There are many countries that highly depend on Latin America, on extractive industries, and how are we able to go through that transition and to generate employment or absorb clean technologies, clean energy technologies without affecting the country's GDP. Therefore, I consider that this is a cross-cutting issue and the involvement is of all fields. There are many technologies that require innovation. They are in initial phases, in test runs. Some of them are very costly, and there's a great space of creativity and innovation which is still open. I love thinking that there are many technologies that we haven't even thought of yet, and they might take place of wherever it may be. So I believe that the innovation space is also an important opportunity for the region. Thank you, Natalia. I have a question from Nora Lipchik. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Considering the scale of good practices and landscapes for the measures to be taken, there's an issue in terms of the scalability and landscapes. I want to add this to Noel Rojas' question. If we consider we need to promote these solutions to have carbon dioxide removal take place. I would say, as I briefly said in my presentation, the best option is to be able to have a portfolio of different technologies and techniques that are adapted to the local context. For that, we would require to have a governance scheme, a territorial jurisdiction at all levels. We might have global ones, we may have local measures, but it's key to be able to attain these sorts of initiatives and to have the co-benefits that we have in mind without affecting and improving the life quality of local communities. There's no magic solution or one measure for all. I think that we have to build that portfolio based on what is necessary in each context. Thank you, Natalia. There's a question which is specifically about the mostly used for the effects of greenhouse effect gases. How do we measure them? I wanted to link that question to another one because also in legislation or in legal systems, we have to see how to report them. So this need of having measurement systems, do you have an input in regards to that field of work of how do I establish information systems? How do I measure this? How do I report them in terms of removal? As I mentioned in my presentation, there are different ways to report the greenhouse effect gases in many of these treaties and international frameworks, but I consider that each solution of CDR has different methods, and there are still many gaps and challenges ahead for these methodologies to be as best as possible and to speak of the best way to measure the gases we have. But I'll give the floor to Natalia to reflect upon this. In effect, it's one of the largest challenges in terms of the technologies of CDRs. For instance, technologies in terms of the design of the system are easier to measure how much carbon is being absorbed throughout the direct capture in the air, or solutions based on nature are a bit more complicated. It sometimes depends on the type of crops, of forest crops or permanents that we are using. There are still many gaps and much to learn in this regard in terms of measuring and verifying. Without a doubt, we have to bear in mind, as I had said previously ago in my presentation, that there are many lessons that we can learn from the Kyoto Protocol or RED Plus for the verification mechanisms and tools. I would like to comment on two things in terms of the players that I left aside. I think that the Ministry of the Environment has to quickly find those who will benefit with these solutions or the potential beneficiaries so that you can include other sectors based on that. And of course, throughout a public policy, you need to provide the profitability for those specific sectors so that there's a virtuous circle. In terms of measurements, which would also be important, not only for measurements in themselves, but for the adoption of public policies in a timely way based on the scale. And for many other reasons, you have a large deficit with the forestry inventories, and you have very little work done in the decertification, soil decertification. You would have to be using with way more solvency, frequency, the use of remote perception throughout satellite technology in order to validate on site. And that allows you to have reports with a larger frequency and in a more accurate way.
Thank you, José Luis. I'm sorry, I just lost my screen with the Q&A section.
Hay una pregunta de Jorge
There is a
Romero.
question from Jorge Romero
Entiendo una preocupación al
that
mencionar que si sería
expresses a
posible con el Acuerdo
concern,
de París cuando los gobiernos para
saying
solucionar
that
aumentan
if it is possible to
basados
meet the
en
Paris
ese
Agreement
de combustibles
to solve the economic crisis based on fossil fuel.
Segunda pregunta que
And I
llega
want to add the
de
question to a second one that comes from
Renata Medina, que es un poco más
Renata Medina, that is more specific
y ella dice cómo hacer
to CDR.
sensibles como los que tenemos en América
How can sensitive economy countries such as the ones in Latin America can meet
¿no?
these
Un paréntesis,
goals
y en
of
realidad
carbon removal?
compromisos asumidos, la eliminación per se, ¿no? Cada país
Because
en
it
realidad
would be understood that these are not assumed commitments per se.
de eliminación
And
de
she rounds
carbono
this
en
up
otras partes
saying
del
that
mundo que
asking
sirvan
if
como
there
experimento.
are success stories in other parts of the world that can
Si queremos
be
ahora ir
used
al
as
revés,
reference.
Luis y después Vanessa o Natalia.
I
si
don't know
quieren.
if we want to start the other way around. What do you think?
Para una región como la nuestra, justo el tema de la presentación.
In a region such as ours, in my presentation, I said that there are sectors that are good in all areas that help us not only to capture or remove CO2, but also help us to improve the quality of development. So what we're doing here is what we're doing here is say that it is not meeting the Paris Agreement is not more expensive.
Hay unos pocos sectores que te dan esas ventajas. Uno de esos son soluciones basadas
only a few sectors that have this advantage. And for Latin America, just Natalia was showing in her cost variation graph, it is a region where this is very cheap and it could also have several co-benefits.
Convencerse con la evidencia
we need to convince ourselves with evidence that alternatives are better for the development style of Latin America, and that this is not more expensive, it is cheaper and it is better.
También me gustaría decir que muchas
Daniel, I would like to say that many solutions from the CDR, especially soil solutions, if implemented sustainably, can have several benefits, as Jose Luis said. For instance, in agricultural systems, we have seen in certain cases that when farmers implement these management practices that increase the capture of carbon in the soil, they see better cost benefits in their systems. Of course, we do not know very well about all the contexts in which this can take place, but there are several researches that can help us understand in a better way how to implement these practices to attain these objectives. I would also like to share with you that there are success cases. In my home state of California in the United States, we have a project called the Marine Carbon Project in the northern part of California, where several management practices are being implemented to store carbon in the soil, and it has been quite successful. We have seen a better quality of soil, and we have seen how cows would rather eat the plants that are involved in those systems. And I believe that these examples can be useful for countries in Latin America.
En la tablita que yo les estaba mostrando,
in the chart that I was showing you, in the one with the green colors, we had the potential of carbon capture with farming, where you have a productivity of 2.5% more than with traditional farming. This means that you are multiplying your productivity in 2.5-fold without degrading your land, without increasing costs. So it is a win-win situation. This is the type of example that allows us to see the advantages of those solutions. Latin America has another advantage, and we should do these joint explorations. Latin America, unlike Germany, England, or the United States, is between the two tropics, Cancer and Capricornus. And it is where you get the best weather for biological productivity, where nature flourishes easily. And this is one of the advantages that we should embrace in our regions. It is not the natural advantage of Russia, the United States, or Canada, and we should embrace it.
Gracias, José Luis. Natalia, vi que abriste tu micrófono.
Thank you, José Luis. Natalia, I don't know if you want to say anything else. Yes. I would just like to say that with the COVID and recovery processes, we saw recently that the oil prices went down. It stopped being profitable for several countries, and now countries have to start implementing recovery processes. This is a great opportunity to start planning processes that consider these type of solutions that are more environmentally friendly or that can have more associated benefits. In practice, it is complicated because we are a part of systemic inertia system. We are still oil producers and we keep on doing it because it has always been this way. And the process of planning and changing is quite long. Many times it requires creativity, and many times it is more comfortable to stay where we are. However, I believe that one of the opportunities that the pandemic has brought to us is the recovery process and to have more sustainable recovery processes. Could I add something else?
Con respecto a las soluciones tecnológicas, también quería resaltar
regarding technological solutions, I also wanted to highlight the use of carbon. It is possible to create several commercial products from captured carbon, as I mentioned in my presentation. You can make beverages or different things that people use on a daily basis, such as watches. But this solution from the CPR presents a very significant market that Latin America could probably use to its benefit. We have seen in Carbon 180 that in the United States, we have a $1 trillion available market for these products that are carbon-based. And I wanted to stress on this fact and say that this could be another way in which CDR could promote or could help economies. Thanks to the three of you. I was having a good time reading all the questions that we got. I'm sorry that we won't have time to answer all of them, but I can see that people are quite interested in some specific solutions. Unfortunately, we need to close right now. And we had agreed with the panelists that we were going to have a last round here. And I would like to ask you to convey a message in less than 1 minute for the participants that we have had in this session. Could you please convey them a message, something that they could take home to continue looking into this topic? What is it that you would like to convey? So please, Vanessa, you're first. Thank you very much. The message that I would like to convey is that the removal of carbon dioxide is very important for us to achieve our climate objectives. And we need to take steps to get to these solutions at a large scale in the fastest way possible. I believe that Latin America has a large role in this achievement. There are several different solutions, and we should think about each one of them considering their context and a specific project for them to make sure that they are implemented in a sustainable way and that they are in these communities that want these solutions and that they can have the benefits that the CDR can offer?
Yo diría que la mitigación sigue siendo siempre
I
nuestra
would
prioridad
say
número
that
uno.
mitigation is always our #1 priority.
Un tema que
And
se
although
es importante empezar a pensar
CDR is a topic that is
oportunidades,
coming in the long
riesgos,
term, we need to
desde,
start thinking
desde
about
ahora,
opportunity, risks,
no,
advantages or
que no
disadvantages for
caiga
Latin
en una
America and the
depresión, digamos,
Caribbean,
en el momento
so
de
that we're
implementar
not
ciertas
caught off guard in the future when implementing certain technologies or techniques.
Gracias, Natalia.
Thank you,
De acuerdo
Natalia.
contigo, ¿no?
And I agree with
Estaba
you.
mencionando en un momento que se me fue la señal y me quedé hablando sola acá como moderadora. Pero
I was mentioning
como
this when
estos
I lost
temas,
my connection and I was just talking to myself. But I was saying that
los
these
esfuerzos de
carbon
mitigación.
removal issues do not replace mitigation efforts, but they complement each
Deben
other
ser además muy ambiciosos y estos esfuerzos
because
complementan
countries need to be
aumentan
very ambitious in these
esfuerzo.
terms.
José Luis,
And they need
tu
to
último
increase their
mensaje, ¿qué le quieres
efforts.
dejar a los participantes?
Jose Luis, what message would you like to convey to the attendees?
Siempre
Two
mejora
things.
conjunto.
I think that it is always better to learn with someone instead of doing it by yourself
Se comparten con mucho trabajo. Entonces,
and
ojalá
then share it in a difficult way. Hopefully, this discovery process that is taking place would be done together.
básicamente salvo una de
And
las
second,
soluciones, las 5 que estamos viendo,
apart from one solution, number 5, all of the solutions are basically for the rural areas. And this is an area that would have great benefit if these solutions are applied.
económicamente para que sea un sector que se
If they are technically viable, it doesn't mean that it has to be for a certain area. For that, we still need to work on it. And if we already have an environmental solution, it doesn't mean that it is well built already. So we have a double message here. We need to reflect on economic development, and we also need to share our knowledge as soon as possible.
Totalmente de acuerdo con eso también.
I completely agree with that as well.
Para nosotros como plataforma Let's Slack, ese es el objetivo también, tener todos
And
estos
for
aprendizaje entre
Let's
pares.
Slack, that is also our objective, to have a room for learning and for our countries to share our knowledge and to learn from each other to accelerate all change processes.
Me han
And
gustado las
not
tres
to do it
presentaciones,
individually. I would like to thank the three of you for your presentations. I believe that they have been excellent. I am also very glad that the attendees have been very interested in them. And since we know that this topic is quite broad,
espacios de seguir
I hope that
profundizando.
we can have more opportunities to
Les lido con
keep
el mismo
on
código
addressing this
G.
topic.
Les va a quedar abierta una pantalla en la que les
And
estamos preguntando
please go back to Slido with the same code C2G, where we will be asking
específicos les
you
interesaría
if
que
you have any questions regarding the topic, if there's anything you need to understand, what specific topics
para poder después
you
hacerle
would like to
seguimiento,
address in the next webinars,
les gustaría seguir. Ya para los
so that we
últimos
can
minutos,
know what your interests are. And for the next minutes, I would like to give the floor to Alia Hassan from C2G, with whom we have been working on this series of webinars.
Para que cierre, para encargarle el cierre.
For the closing remarks.
Adelante, Alia.
Gracias, Aida. Bueno,
Please, Alia, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Jose Luis and his team from CEPAL, from ECLAC, for this collaboration in this series of webinars. Also, Aida and her team from Let's Slack. We have conducted a series of webinars regarding these topics that incorporated CDR and also the modification of solar radiation. We had our first webinar in May where we explored weather simulator tool to see what impact the CDR could have on the climate change goals. We did one on that and also another one on solar radiation. And this links these SDGs and zero net emissions in the region. Therefore, you can find all this information in both English and Spanish in our website in C2G and also in the website of Let's Slack. I would also like to let you know that in C2G, we have created a series of webinars to strengthen the knowledge at a worldwide level in these topics. We have 13 webinars that have been uploaded into our website, webinars and also informal speeches. That is a different format, but I would like to invite you to get to know. This information is being translated into Spanish so that you can all have access to it. It's also being translated into French and Mandarin Chinese. And here we have the link in the chat box. And it's T2G2net, and it is still being built, the part in Spanish, but it should be up in a couple of weeks. If you have any suggestions, we are very interested on knowing about what type of topics you would like to address in future online events. And if so, you can drop a message at the address being shown in the screen. It's been a pleasure to work with all of you, and I'm sure that this is the beginning of a collaboration that will be kept over time. And as Jose Luis said, we have this consultancy done together to see how we're doing. We're creating policy recommendations so that decision makers in the region can have information at hand to make decisions that can allow us to continue making progress in CDR. And I hope we can continue working together over time. If you are studying, let's not forget that this topic needs still more research, and we're still working on it in this region. Thank you very much.
Alia.
Thank you, Alia.
A C2G y a CEPAL por esta
Thank you to C2G and ECLAC for the series of webinars that we have conducted together. And as I said at the beginning, this fourth webinar, this fourth out of four, that we have conducted with Let's Slack, Euroclima Plus, and UNDP. And all the information related to this session is available in that website shown on the screen. And our next events, we have a session tomorrow that can be interesting to you because it's related to this topic. And it says increasing the transparency in reports in the forestry sector. The experience of Project ICAT in Argentina. On Thursday, there is a seminar on long-term strategies for the transportation sector in Latin America and in the Caribbean. And on Friday, we have a session with invitation that has a dialogue between pairs to promote the implementation of the NDCs in Latin America. And with that, we would like to conclude, and I hope that this information has been useful for you, and I hope to meet you in the future. Thank you very much. Vanessa, Natalia, and Jose Luis. Thank you.